Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Please like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. Today's kind of a 2-for-1. There was a paper recently published, I believe in January, coming out of China. 2 new species in the genus Sinonychus, which are Elmid beetles. And so I figured we could talk about both this paper and the taxonomy of elmids. For those of you unfamiliar, elmids are a type of aquatic beetle. Specifically, they're called the Riffle Beetles because they tend to live in areas of streams that are kind of shallow and fast moving and generally have high oxygen. So think very shallow rapids. And within North America, being the United States and Canada, there's about 100 species in 25 genera, but globally there's only 2 subfamilies, the Elmini and the Lorraini, with the Elmini being by far the largest. Globally, there's about 1,300 species of the Elmines, and in the US there's about 97, whereas with the Lorraini, there's only about 160 species globally, and only 3 species in North America, north of Mexico. And these 2 groups are generally fairly easy to distinguish, and they have very different lifestyles. The Lorraini are generally associated with riparian environments. So these are areas near streams or on the banks of streams, and they don't generally spend their time in the water. There are some differences with their leg structures, but the most obvious differences between them and the Elmini are, one, the Lorraini are covered very densely with hairs, like you can see here in this picture, whereas the Elmines tend to have relatively few hairs. The Lorraini as well tend to have a softer, sort of leathery body structure, whereas the Elmines tend to have a much more sclerotized, harder body structure. So the Elmines are harder and have fewer hairs. Additionally, the Elmines tend to have an actual functional plastron, which is a structure which allows them to retain air bubbles next to their body, because the Elmines spend all of their time underwater. So the Lorraini are associated with the edges of waters, and the Elmines are actually associated with the aquatic environment. They spend most of their life underwater, including both the adults and the larvae, only emerging to the sides of water for pupation. And they typically don't swim. They tend to cling to the bottom of the riffles. They walk around on the rocks, things like that. And this whole group is vegetarian. So like when the Elmines are walking around the riffles, they are feeding on the algae and the biofilms, things like that, the little plants that grow on the rocks. And the Lorraini are feeding on the little plants on the sides of the stream. Generally speaking, this whole family of the Elmidae are very small, usually less than 8 millimeters. They tend to be dark, relatively dark colored, kind of a dark brown, black, or gray. Sometimes they have a little bit of patterning. They are generally associated with this shallow, rapidly moving water, either in it or onto the sides of it. And the larvae of this group are all aquatic. You can see the larvae here. They tend to have these abdominal gills on the tips of their abdomen, which are retractable. And they also have a series of hooks on their abdomen, which are also retractable, and those help them cling to the surface of rocks and things like that. They tend to be kind of hooked, although they come in lots of different shapes. Some of them are very thin, and some of them have this kind of weird bulbous thorax. But they come in many, many different shapes and sizes, but they're all aquatic. They all spend their entire life underwater until they're ready to pupate. So that leads us into this paper that just came out of China on the genus Sinonychus. And these researchers discovered 2 new species of Elmid beetles, specifically the subfamily Elmini, since that is the much larger one, within streams in China. And the 2 species which are identified here are Sinonychus lipini and Sinonychus luodionensis. And you can see those species, or those 2 species here. A is Sinonychus lipini, and B is Sinonychus luodionensis, which are very different sizes and very different antennal structures. One of the interesting things about these beetles, which you sometimes see more in like the Cuculionids, the weevils, is that they are covered with a sort of iridescent pubescence. So they have scales all over their head which refract the light. And you see this more in land-dwelling beetles, but it's interesting to see these within the aquatic beetles as well. The majority of this group, the Sinonychus, have to be distinguished by the male Aedeagus. Definitively. They have very, very different genital structures within the males, and you find this a lot within the beetles. If you want very accurate species determination, you will need to do a genital dissection, which can be very difficult if you aren't used to doing this sorts of dissections. But generally, this group is very small, usually less than 1.5 millimeters. So we're talking about very, very small beetles here that live within these little riffles. You can see one here. This is Sinonychus luodionensis in the water. They generally have a series of sublateral grooves on the pronotum, which, going back to that original, you can see here on the pronotum that they have a series of sublateral grooves. The pronotum is fairly wide. You have a series of elytral carinae along the elytral intervals. Because these beetles spend their entire life in the water as an adults, they actually don't have hind wings under their elytra. These elytra are entirely for protection of the abdomen. There's no wings for flight underneath. And the legs can be fairly diagnostic for this group. Generally, the Elmidae tend to have these very long spidery legs, which help them crawl around on the rocks. As far as the habitat for Sinonychus lipini, you can see it here. You have some of these in the water. They're very, very small. In order to collect these, you do have to spend quite a bit of time rummaging around the riffles, panning things out to pick out these beetles, which honestly sounds like a fun time. But I will link this paper in the description. It's not very long if you wanted to read through it, and I'll talk to you guys later.